nestled deep within the northern mountain range where ancient trees stretched toward the clouds, was a familiar haunt for Nam, a 35-year-old lumberjack with calloused hands and eyes as sharp as a blade. Born into a family of traditional woodworkers in a village at the foot of the mountains, Nam had followed his father into the forest since childhood, learning to distinguish every type of tree, from sturdy oak to fragrant pine, and mastering the use of sharp tools to transform massive trunks into perfect logs. Now, with over a decade of experience, Nam was regarded as one of the finest lumberjacks in the region, renowned for his precision and remarkable endurance. It was late spring, March 25, 2025, when Nam decided to venture into the forest to complete one last order before the rainy season arrived. The clear blue sky of the morning had faded into a pale gray, with thick clouds drifting lazily over the mountain peaks. He carried an old, weathered canvas bag containing his essentials, a bottle of spring water, a dry loaf of bread, and, most importantly, his prized saw, a masterpiece nearly 2 meters long, wider than a grown man's hand, with razor-sharp steel teeth hand-forged by Old Man Tin, a skilled blacksmith from the village. This saw wasn't just a tool, it was Nam's pride. He'd once boasted to friends that with just 5 strokes, he could fell a tree a meter wide without breaking a sweat. When Nam reached the forest, the sun was dipping toward the west, casting a brilliant orange glow over the dense canopy. The faint chirping of sparrows echoed from afar, mingling with the rustling of dry branches in the strengthening wind, a natural symphony Nam had grown accustomed to. He selected an ancient pine tree, over 30 meters tall, its straight trunk covered in cracked bark and green moss. This was premium wood, sought after by workshops in the lowlands for crafting high-end furniture. Nam smiled, running his hand gently along the saw as if greeting an old friend, then set to work. He stood firm in his worn-out spiked boots, positioning the saw against a white chalk line he'd marked on the trunk. With a decisive pull, he began, the dry crack of splitting wood ringing out, accompanied by the pungent scent of pine resin wafting from the cut. Nam worked with a steady rhythm, pull, push, pull, push, each stroke precise and mechanical. Sawdust flew in all directions, clinging to his faded green shirt, its shoulders threadbare from years of labor, but he paid it no mind. His muscular hands gripped the saw's handle tightly, veins bulging beneath his sun-tanned skin, sweat trickling down his forehead and dripping onto the ground in tiny beads. The job went smoothly. Nam had already felled 3 large trees and now faced the final one. The wind picked up, carrying a chill from deep within the valley. The canopy above rustled fiercely, as if the forest were stirring awake, whispering warnings Nam didn't heed. He was too engrossed in his task, his deep brown eyes fixed on the deepening cut in the trunk. The wind's howl blended with the saw's sharp whine, creating an eerie sound, but Nam dismissed it as a sign of approaching dusk. He urged himself to hurry, eager to finish and head home before darkness swallowed the forest. As the saw sliced nearly halfway through the trunk, a sudden noise pierced the air, a sharp, dry crack from above, distinct from the sound of the wood splitting beneath his hands. Nam paused for a moment, tilting his head to peer through the thick foliage, searching for the source. But the light was too dim, revealing only swaying shadows in the wind. He shrugged, assuming it was just a squirrel or a small branch falling, and resumed his work. Yet the instant he pulled the saw again, a massive dark shape plummeted from over 10 meters above. It was a colossal dry branch, as thick as a man's calf and nearly 5 meters long, likely rotted through and waiting for a strong gust to snap it free. It crashed directly onto the moving saw in Nam's hands. The branch's weight, combined with the saw's spinning force, wrenched it from his grasp entirely. The saw slipped free like a wild beast breaking its chains, spinning wildly in midair with terrifying speed. Its gleaming steel teeth flashed under the fading light, reflecting the sunset's orange hue like a ring of deadly fire. Time seemed to slow in Nam's eyes. He heard the wind's shriek merge with the metal's roar, felt the cold rush of air as the saw whizzed past his face, missing his nose by less than an inch. Survival instinct surged within him, and he threw every ounce of strength into his legs, leaping to the left with all the speed his body could muster. He crashed to the ground, his knee slamming into an exposed root, his shirt tearing at the elbow as he slid across the dry leaves. A deafening thud followed. The saw plunged into the earth, landing less than a hand's breadth from his boot tip. It quivered violently, carving a long, deep gash into the soft soil, sending sawdust and dirt billowing like a small cloud. Nam lay there, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest as if it might burst free. Cold sweat streamed from his temples down his cheeks, mixing with the dirt caked on his face. He stared at the saw, still embedded in the ground, its once shiny blade now streaked with soil and resin, a stark reminder of its lethal power. Then he looked up at the canopy, where the branch had fallen, realizing how careless he'd been. This forest wasn't just a workplace, it was a labyrinth of hidden dangers. Rotted branches, sudden gusts, and the smallest misstep could cost him his life. After a long while, as his breathing steadied, Nam sat up slowly. His knee throbbed, his elbow bled, but he ignored the pain. He staggered to his feet and approached the saw, his hands trembling as he touched its wooden handle, still warm from friction. He inspected it closely, noticing a few chipped teeth, the first damage in all the years he'd wielded it. Nam sighed, sheathed the saw, and decided to call it a day. That night, sitting by the fire in his small home at the mountain's base, he recounted the story to his wife, his voice low but unable to mask the lingering terror in his mind. From that day on, Nam transformed his approach to work. He never started a cut without thoroughly inspecting his surroundings, from the dry branches dangling overhead to the roots hidden beneath the leaf litter below. He began wearing a hard hat and carrying a long stick to prod suspicious branches before beginning. The long, wide saw remained his indispensable companion, but he now regarded it with a mix of respect and wariness. Each time he picked it up, he recalled that harrowing afternoon in Mist Hill Forest, when death had been a mere breath away, and the silent woods taught him the most valuable lesson of his life. Survival depended not just on skill, but on caution.